Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Lockdown LitFest. As ever, we are working hard to provide you with some entertainment, some information, hopefully some amusement through some of UK publishing's greatest output, its wonderful writers, thinkers, philosophers, and so on. As ever, we hope you're looking after yourselves. We hope you're well. We hope you're not lonely. We know this is a tough time for everybody, not least us. We are normal people trying to do a normal job in very abnormal times. We've got a bit of a treat for you today. He's a debut novelist who some of you may have heard of. Alec is a man who hails from Essex in the mid-70s. He graduated from Newcastle University with a first-class degree in history. He began his journalism career on the Western Morning News in Cornwall and went on to write for titles which include the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Times, and the London Evening Standard, and in 2008 was named as an Editor of the Year by the British Society of Magazine Editors. He's now the editor-at-large of Spears magazine, a title focused on luxury lifestyles. And if any of the readers of Spears are listening, please do make contact with us. We'd be delighted to welcome you to be patrons of the Lockdown LitFest. Alec, it's a very great pleasure for me to be able to say a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest. Can you tell us where you are? It looks like a fascinating shed.
Yes, hello, Paul. I am in my shed, which is a thing that every man needs. And I didn't realise it was going to become quite so important to my life. I have converted it lovingly, and it's insulated. It feels quite arctic half the time and sweaty and hot the other half the time. Behind me, you can probably see a pile of detritus of children. I've got buggies, scooters. I mean, there's so much redundant equipment in there, which is waiting for our number two to use it. So yes, forgive the mess, but it's creative. It's a creative mess.
No need for forgiveness or apologies, Alex. As I said in my introduction, we're all normal people trying to lead normal lives in abnormal times, and it's good to see a writer in a shed, as a writer should be, and that the shed is multitasked for storage as well. As I said in my introduction, you read history, you took a first-class degree from Newcastle, and then went straight, it seems to me, if I've read your biography correctly, straight into journalism, which makes me think there was always the will to write, the will to analyse, the will to contextualise events that happen today in a sort of historical context. Would that be right?
Absolutely, yeah. I essentially became a journalist because I wanted to write. And when I was at university, I wrote plays, and I wanted to continue to write. So I thought of the law as potentially somewhere one could write, but then journalism, frankly, was a much more obvious contender for a writer. And so that's what led me to it. Now, of course, I like getting a story. A scoop is fun, but I remember my first ever interview for the Western Morning News. The managing editor said, "Are you a writing journalist or a news hound journalist?" And not wanting to put him off me, I said, "Well, a bit of both, I think." But I think in truth, I am a writing journalist, and I take the pleasure in fact, there's a spider walking along the wall of the shed just here. I take the interest in the writing. And so as to history, well, I study history because I've always been obsessed about it. And in fact, it was many years before I wrote a book that was historical novel, because a friend of mine said, "Look, Alec, you've written a couple of books that no one's interested in, the contemporary, but you're obsessed about the past. Why don't you think about historical novels?" I thought, well, come on. But eventually I took his advice, and actually I've loved every minute of it, because, you know, bringing the past alive, as you get older, you realise how far away the past is. Bringing it alive with fiction is a great joy, and it reminds people about the past, which is important.
Can I slow you up a bit there? Before we come to historical fiction, I'd like to tease apart the journalism career. I'm interested in the distinction that your editor made and that you made, the distinction between a writing journalist and a news hound journalist. Can you unpack that for us? What do those terms mean for those that aren't familiar with the requirements of journalism?
Yeah, well, I think if you were to browse through a newspaper, you'd find, or look online, you'll find news on the front page, and as you go through the newspaper, it gets softer and softer. So you eventually read the comment pages, and then that's people just forming lovely ideas with words, and then you reach sort of features pages where there are, people in cars or dresses or cakes talking about passions, and it becomes more flowery and it becomes less hard. And so there is a species of journalist who most of us can imagine typified by a spitting image with sort of pig faces, the ones that go snuffling after the truffles, going, sifting through litter, knocking on doors. And I've not done the litter, but I've knocked on doors, and I've, followed people on scooters, which, is now, should be illegal if it wasn't then. And all that kind of stuff that you end up being asked to do, but actually for some circumstances, without jumping ahead of myself, there's aspects of it which are morally corrosive for the individual involved. But then the other extreme, you have the journalists who write fanciful articles about nature or the changing seasons, or or just soft features about clothes or whatever it is. And that they're different arts, and people who write obituaries are different from people who write leaders, who are different from people who write the nature column or the sports pages, which is a foreign world to me, the sports pages, or the music reviews, goodness me. So there's a whole galaxy of people who put these things together, as well, Blaise. But I think what he wanted was a reporter, somebody who can go out and get news and find news, and therefore I knew that's what I had to tell him, that I was one of those too. But in truth, as much as I love finding stories, I've always been more of a writer, and I mean, I've taught myself out on that one. There you are. Back to you.
I used to feel a bit of shame in this area because for a number of years I was very happily taken on as a freelancer by the Independent on Sunday to write monthly the long form author interview, and got to interview everybody from sort of Richard Allen to Seamus Heaney and so on and so forth. And people would call me a journalist. And I thought, I don't deserve that title. I've never had to sort of knock on doorsteps. I call up an author that I fancy interviewing, get to spend a day chatting with them, usually over tea or a gin or scotch in Seamus's case and so on. And I always felt sort of a less of a man for not being a journalist. Do those two from your experience, both as an editor and a journalist, do those two parts of journalism sort of, is there an antagonism between them? Does one look down on the other?
I don't know. So they're very different, is what I'll say. Now, for many years, I was a gossip columnist, right. Which again, it is what it is. I worked for the Peterborough column. I worked for the Telegraph, the Times, and I would go to parties and I would talk to people, and if in doubt, ask someone about their next holiday, and get gossip. Now, some gossip columnists would go for the divorces. They go for the nasty breakups. They go for, who's loving, who's having an affair with who, and try and get all the salacious stuff. For me, the sort of gossip story I loved was the sort of thing where I once saw Norman Lamont trying to get his coat at the end of a party somewhere, and the girl from on the other side of the counter was not from the UK, was young, had no idea who he was, and I think it was like Bill Cash standing behind him saying, "Do you know this man is the former Chancellor of the Exchequer?" And this is, of course, fun, but it's a hilarious moment. He can see his coat, but he can't get it because he's lost his chit. Or, I've always enjoyed being a gossip columnist, but it's a very different thing. And so I think you in the end, you just need to have the people who like doing certain sorts of stories, doing certain sorts of areas. And you can't send the literary interviewer to go and do a death knock and to get the interview with whoever it is, but I would send you to go and interview, Captain Tom, or Sir Tom, as he'll be if he's not already, because you treat it with the kind of lyrical flourish that's required for the task.
It's very well described. In fact, one of my co-founders, Panos Dave, once earned his corn by being a writer for gossip columns. He said, I think I'm not misquoting him, but he explained once that it was the most corrosive thing he's ever done on his emotion. You're having to get people to trust you, to tell you the stuff that you would gossip about, and then you're selling it to a newspaper. I think it's a tough gig. I know lots of other gossip columnists who revel in it, and some who find it really rather hard. Let's come to history and historical fiction. I'm intrigued in the career of any writer. It usually turns out that they have started off as children as very avid readers, with either an inspirational teacher or a parent that read them, and it starts with a love of story. Was that the case with you? Yeah,
as a child, actually, for various reasons, I break the mold. I was a pretty slow reader. I mean, it was really uninspiring and actually not very impressive. So I should probably edit this part for the interview. But when I did get to read, I loved things like Horner and the Bolitho series, those sort of nautical 19th century serials of sort of boys' own type adventures on high seas. And And I was a voracious reader of comics as a kid. The more violent, the better. I think comics were great, and I seem to spend a lot of time sort of drawing sort of comic books and all that kind of stuff as a young child. And then as I got older, this is much older, I became obsessed, like a lot of people often are, with certain periods. And so into adulthood, having dabbled with the Russians and various other people when I was at school, and discovered all sorts. You're asking me to go back a long time. I discovered all sorts of things that I did not know existed. And eventually, I realised that the only fiction I read was historical in a limited sense, but utterly modern. So I spent my life trawling through Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Evelyn Waugh and Green and a bit of Christie. In the end, not really. I realised at one point I hardly read a book written after 1970, which is not something I advocate, especially as an author now. But it's strange, isn't it? How you can become quite narrow. Kingsley Amis, what a genius! I wish I'd had an opportunity to interview him, but as a journalist. But so I think coming to the past through fiction, I never actually wanted to write historic fiction. When I took my first job in Cornwall as a reporter, aged 20, I was writing my first novel, and that was a contemporary novel. Of course, it was about a journalist in the provinces. I wanted to write something that was, Amisian, if one can make that adjective, because that's what I loved. And I thought that's what I'll do. And I'll write the next great English novel about the here and now. And that, that garnered actually some interest from a publisher, but it didn't go very far, and it probably wasn't very good, thank goodness for that. But then, eventually, 10 years later, I realised that actually the task of fiction, to raise a name that is often maligned, but I think as a storyteller, can't be done. So I read Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, and, as a writer, I have lots of things to say about it, but as a piece of storytelling, it was thoroughly gripping. And I talked to it, and I thought, well, goodness me, I haven't read a book like this before. This is something else. It's like, it's incredibly powerful, albeit, notwithstanding its limitations, well, one might argue. So I thought, well, I wonder if one can fuse these things, bring a kind of the literary pleasure that I value to a story that is, a rollicking good read, or a good page turner. And I suppose, and then, as I told you, a good old friend of mine said, look, Alec, you should write historic fiction because you're obsessed about it and you live in the past anyway. I thought, actually, the guy's probably right. So I thought I'll sit down and think about conceiving something that I think would appeal, and be historic. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but hopefully that's a bit of an illustration of the journey.
Well, it's a good illustration. I'm intrigued to learn that your rather wonderful sort of set in 1930s historical fiction has in part of its roots in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which you may not be aware of, but in the 90s I wrote a book called The Arcadian Cipher, which was published, which is a sort of follow-on from the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was very heavily mined by Dan Brown, and there was a massive court case about plagiarism and so on and so forth, which I played a very small role in. Right, let's come to you've written a couple of novels, nothing happened. As you say, there was some interest, but of course it's the will of every writer to get published, to find an audience, and the way that happens in the UK and in most of the Western world is you find an audience by getting an agent, by finding a publisher who will support and admire what you're writing, can see the potential. And let's face it, none of our first novels were terribly, unless we're very fortunate, were very good. So it's about earning your spurs and learning how the business works as much as how writing works. Having written a couple that didn't work, what were the lessons that you applied to the writing of Rule Britannia, which is this fantastic, well, you've set up as a series, very ambitious series from the get-go, set in the 1930s. What were the steps that led to the decisions that led to this being the novel?
Okay, well, so imagine this, that I'm sitting in a flat share in West London, and I read the Da Vinci Code over the course of the weekend, and then start thinking, goodness me, this guy's been enormously successful with a book which is thriller. I'm sure I could come up with a story that has a conundrum in it, and could be every bit as good. There are, I mean, come on, got to think big. So I said, right. And so I sat down and then eventually an idea struck me, and it wasn't immediate. It went over a period of time. And then I had to think, well, it's got to be character driven. So I need characters who I want to spend time with and the readers want to spend time with. And, about the same sort of time, I sort of thought about, trying to come up with not a contemporary, but come up, okay, put it this way. I was thinking about, if you want to achieve something in life as a writer, what might there be? Actually, yes, you might want to write the book that is the final statement of now. Okay, look, that would be lovely, right? But actually, if that's not what you're going to do, because you live in the past and all that stuff, you might want to write a book that brings characters to life in a way that is really meaningful. And take, Flashman or a character. Flashman exists for people in such an intense way and has brought such intense enjoyment. Or Holmes and Watson have brought such intense pleasure to people. And I thought actually trying to create something like that would be rather wonderful, and I would be jolly proud to have done that, and that would be a great ambition to try and achieve. Now, of course, it's very ambitious, so I'm not trying to claim that, but just an inspiration. So first thing, come up with a conundrum, a mystery that can be a real kind of burning furnace at the heart of some great dreadnought of a novel. And then the second thing is coming up with characters who I can nurture and create. So the book manifested itself with a friendship at the heart of it. That is to say, in my case, Drabble and Harris. And I'm smiling because I kind of obviously know the bits of people that I've taken from those, and I don't know if they know it too. But there's a friendship at the heart of it. And then you're going to jump in there, Paul?
If I may, because you're answering questions I haven't yet asked. So okay. Maybe take it step by step, if that's all right.
Well, so I got an agent is the answer, I think. Is that where we always get? So eventually I wrote this, and then I found with this book, I found an agent. I must say to aspiring writers that I pitched dozens of agents in the course of the previous 5 years with other books, and with this book, and eventually, it sounds funny. My mother played an intervening hand in this. She said, she called me, darling, have you tried the agent of this author called C.J. Sansom, who wrote Winter in Madrid? I just read it, and it reminds me of, and I thought, oh goodness me, what does my mother know? But sure enough, I looked at the book, then wrote to the agent, and he pinged me an email one Saturday night saying, okay, I've read the first few chapters, have you got any more? And that was in probably late 2007, early 2008. And that was really important because he did become my agent, and then I finished the book. He gave me some great input. Have you considered this? Character A seems to be carrying the freight of the demise of character B rather lightly, only a few pages later. So I gave me some great notes on the book, but crucially led me to take what I was doing seriously, because we all write, but the self-belief is eroded between the age of 20 and 30. Your self-belief is eroded if you fail at things, and so not entirely, but partially. And he gave me the sense to take myself very seriously and actually go, you know what I can do is I'm doing this, and to slay any demons I had about self-belief. So I finished the book. Now, we didn't sell the book, and the book, if I'm not getting ahead of myself, the book, it was 2009. It wasn't a great year to sell books. The publishing industry was on its uppers, but naturally I felt that was an excuse as a writer, because you think, oh, maybe I should have spent longer developing aspects of it, but in the end, so the book went to a hard drive, and it stayed down a hard drive, and Drabble and Harris with his two trapped voices, his two personalities I created in there. And do you want me to go on, Paul? Go on.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because I want to get to the nub of it. Can you talk us through? Can you introduce us? In the first instance, you talk about these two characters. You haven't told us who they are. So can you tell us succinctly who Ernest Drabble is and who the other half of this Drabble and Harris sort of duet is, Mr. Harris?
So they are first and foremost old school friends. And because of my love of Evelyn Waugh, I decided they'd gone to Lancing College together and probably bullied each other at various points. a couple of years below war, who I don't think they like very much. And Ernest Drabble is a historian, and he is a mountaineer. And part of the backstory is that he's recently made an attempt on the north face of the Eiger, which received lots of publicity because his best friend, Percival Harris, he hates his first name, so he's known as Harris, obviously wrote about and exploited as a journalist, writing about his friend, who's henceforth known as the Bouncing Don, because he's a professor at Cambridge, historian. So, and his friend Harris, who is his oldest friend, is a gossip columnist working in a fictitious London, the London Evening Express newspaper, for which I've obviously mined my own experience as a gossip columnist, and as well as the kind of the lovely dystopias presented by Evelyn Waugh in Vile Bodies and other books set in that period against that same setting.
Fantastic. So now we know who Harris and Drabble are. Set us the context. Why did you choose to set these in the 1930s? What is it about the 1930s that allows you to explore these characters and to set effectively what are sort of fantastic sort of Christie-esque crime novels in a way?
Well, thank you. The 1930s it's a big question. I think the brutal answer is the part of the plot requires a specific place in time to work really well, which I won't go into. I'll let you read it. But well, it's set against the abdication crisis, which is in obviously December 1936. So there are aspects where it interweaves in this sense with actual events, and all the stories I intend to weave with actual events to a lesser or greater degree. But why the 30s? Well, I'm 45. When I grew up, almost anyone who was anyone had made it in the 30s. I remember, Peter Ustinov, or David Niven, all these great sort of characters, the Queen Mother. I mean, I say she made it in the 30s, but, all these people who were facets of our national life and global cultural life were people who had come to age then. I think I probably spent rather longer in my childhood watching black and white films where the sound doesn't connect to the visuals. And I kind of have a great affection for the era, this pre-war era, but also the war era, because I think it's what I grew up listening to stories about from people who I love. And so I have a great sense of nostalgia for them. Of course, BBC One was always fighting the Second World War on a Sunday when I grew up. So that is something that rather boringly sticks in your head. In the same way as, the recognition that, I was born in 1975, and 1975 is now closer to the end of the war than it is to now, which is rather shocking as a notion. So the sense of the past and growing up amongst people for whom that was a present and real occasion is very nostalgic to me. And I think I wanted to kind of, it's also, before mobile phones and email, it's also lends itself to beauty and kind of formality and structures and things that have gone. And there's a romance to it. But I think it also leads up to an earth-shattering, globe-changing event, the Second World War. And obviously, the comparisons are overwrought, but what we're living through now is a similar bookend in our lives. And that's fascinating. I think this will inspire a lot of change as well, a lot of fiction.
Nicely described. I'm going to ask you to do a reading in a second, but before you do, there's a rather fantastic, what Hitchcock would have called a MacGuffin in this, just a thing. The thing that you've happened to put in, the MacGuffin in Rule Britannia, featuring Drabble and Harris, is bizarrely the decapitated head of Oliver Cromwell. Alec Marsh, explain why.
Well, okay, so this is, if you are to read the book, much of this explained in the first chapter, but
people are going to read the book to find out about what's the head of Cromwell.
So in essence, Oliver Cromwell, most people understand, he became the kind of first Republican dictator of Britain in 1650, and he died in 1658. Then we had the monarchy back in 1660, and Charles II, he was still pretty unhappy about what had happened to his dad, and so he had 3 of the leading regicides buried up, the ones who had died, and he couldn't do it, and he hanged and sort of desecrated their bodies and kept their heads on spikes above the Palace of Westminster. And it is said that Cromwell's head stayed there for 25 years and eventually blew down in a gale and was taken by a sentry who found it. And he then took it away, bequeathed it to his daughter, and eventually in the 1700s, it ends up in a travelling circus as a freak show exhibit, which is, obviously that's something Cromwell never foresaw happening. And then, lo and behold, it disappears from view before being owned by Canon Wilkinson in Suffolk in the in the 20s and 30s. And eventually, in real life, he gifted it to Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. When it's still there, it is buried apparently in a secret location, so no one can go and take it, because Cromwell remains, a very divisive figure. His statue is outside the Houses of Parliament, but I'm sure a lot of people would not like it to be there. And so I thought there's a great mystery there. Why has this head been so divisive? So I came up with an idea, a fanciful idea that, and I have to say, when I wrote the novel, I actually didn't know what the answer was, but I worked it out and then finessed it, and through drafts you kind of come up with a plan. But the mystery of Cromwell's, the head of Oliver Cromwell, and what has led men to want it and desire it and to regard it as such a sort of item of wonder is at the heart of the book.
It's a collectible, exactly. Nicely described, Alec. Can I invite you there? Would you mind doing our audience the great honour of reading an extract from Rule Britannia, please?
Well, thank you. Yes, I haven't I haven't practiced, so I'm going to read you the first page in a bit, just so that it's obvious where we are. Okay.
Thank you.
Chapter 1, London, December 1936. A fog of tobacco all but concealed the strutting satyrs, winged cherubs, and nude dancing nymphs that adorned the low ceiling of the Granville Club's long bar. The cloud floated over a noisy, bobbing, gaslit landscape of gentlemen patrons, lounging in their deep leather armchairs, standing, chatting in groups, or propped at the bar, spirals of smoke ascending from their pipes, cigars, and cigarettes. There was a lone chromatic renegade among the uniform landscape of black and grey cloth, Ernest Drabble, dressed in a country suit of green herringbone tweed, finished off with a muted yellow waistcoat and a blue and silver striped tie, this of his college, Sidney Sussex, Cambridge. He was 30 years of age and in the prime of life. "It's busy for a Monday," he remarked, as he pressed his stomach against the bar to allow another patron to pass. Drabble's companion, Percival Harris, dismissed this comment with a shake of his head. "You've been hiding away in your ivory tower for too long, Ernest. I've warned you about this before." Harris lifted his silver tankard high above his head and wagged it jauntily. "Let's have another." A moment or two later, the two men raised refreshed pints to their lips. They complimented the brew. Harris nudged Drabble's elbow. "See the chubby chap at the end of the bar?" Drabble scanned the crowd. "Over there," said Harris, pointing brazenly with his tankard. "Barrel-chested fellow, just ordering now." Drabble peered along the bar and saw him. "Reckon if he shaved his hair off, he'd be a spit for Mussolini."
Fantastic, Alec. Thank you very much indeed. Can I say there's a nice thing that your publisher has done, given the books are set in the 30s, with some rather astonishingly beautiful book covers. Can you hold the cover of your book up in front of your chest so that we can actually have a look at it? It's really, you might want to raise it a little so it's screen height. Up a little bit more. Yeah, look at that. Now that's a good book cover. However, I also happen to know, thank you very much indeed to put it down. I also happen to know that book number 2 is already waiting in the wings. It's entitled Enemy of the Raj, and it has an astonishingly beautiful book cover, which I'm sure you probably can't show us because it isn't out yet. But can you tell us what we can expect from Enemy of the Raj, book number 2 in the Drabble and Harris series?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Blaise. I have some. I think the cover's beautiful, it's now out there digitally, but not. I haven't got a copy yet. So, Enemy of the Raj is set in months after this book. It's set in April 1937 in India, obviously, and it begins with a tiger shoot. And not to go into too much detail, but in essence, Harris has a lifelong ambition to shoot a tiger, and because that's what people did in those days, and it's because exactly, it's because his ancestors have done it, and he doesn't want to be the last Harris not to shoot a tiger. So he says, right, we're going to go do this, and Drabble goes along because we discover that Drabble spent his first years as a sort of armed forces child in India, and although he despises colonialism, would like to go and discover more and revisit the place of his birth, as it were. So they have this, they go along and there's a tiger shoot, and then of course Harris has justified the trip because he's going to interview a leading Maharaja called, his name just escaped me, which is a dreadful thing to do for a writer. He's the Maharaja of Bikaner, Suganga Singh, and so the plot unfolds essentially in Delhi, and then they have a jolly, ripping jaunt in Rajasthan, in this lovely desert kingdom, as was Bikaner, which I went to last year to do some research, and was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And it's a sort of sandy kingdom, which became, because of the Maharaja, a real place. So the Maharaja, just in a minute, there's a portrait of him in the National Portrait Gallery, but he was the only Indian, if I'm correct, to sign the Treaty of Versailles. He was in the Imperial War Cabinet. He sent his camel corps to fight in the First World War. And he was this amazing, large-in-life figure. He electrified Bikaner. He built 1,000 miles of canal to stop it drying out and getting famine. So there's this lovely real character at the centre who I'm delighted, if the book does nothing else, it tells the world a bit about this guy, because we should know about these people. And he also was a curiosity because he was a patriot about the empire, which of course is a deeply unfashionable thing. So, but the story is a jolly good thriller, and it grows the characters, and we learn more about them. And crucially, it's written 10 years after Rule Britannia, so it's a slightly better novel, I think, if I dare I say that. But it's different because I'm different, and I suppose that's natural.
Two quick final questions for me, Alec, and brief answers, if you will, although they're quite tough questions. What do you think good historical fiction should do? What makes good historical fiction?
Well, I think it's got to bring the past alive and remind people in a truthful way, which is the challenge, because obviously fiction, you want to use your imagination, about things that have happened in the past. So I think educationally, I think it's important, but also it underscores the universality of ourselves and the human condition.
That's a really nice answer. Final question for me then. Given that you research your books, as you've just very beautifully explained with the research trip you had to India, where does I've always thought of historical fiction as, the fiction is the gaps in the paving stones, and the paving stones are the actual history. How do you inject a story, and what is your responsibility to the fact, the real history?
I think that's really important. So take the treatment of real life historical characters in my books, but I think a lot of fiction, I try to leave real life historical characters out as much as possible and let them, so Churchill features in Rule Britannia, but you really only see the glow of his cigar and one sentence story, because we'll know he wasn't there. So as a reader, you get bumped out of the story when you know it's bogus, right? That's the first thing. You read it, no, I don't believe that. But the second thing, but of course, Hilary Mantel delivers that so well, because you read her books and you believe every second. So it's not entirely true, but generally speaking, when your protagonists are not famous historical figures, when you then meet a historical figure who you know is real, it's bogus, and it doesn't work. And also, you're disobliging them because they weren't there and they weren't really doing that. So I believe you have to be very respectful of the past is the short answer, and not to change things. And if you do change things, you have to say loud and clear at the end, by the way, folks, I'm sorry, I did this. So in Rule Britannia, I moved Canon Wilkinson from Suffolk to Devon, or to Cornwall, because I wanted to have a sleeper train in the story, But I hope he forgives me.
No historical fiction writer worth their salt has not thought of the television adaptation or the film, especially when it's character driven. So final question from me. In your fantasy universe, who do you see playing Drabble and Harris?
Now that's an incredibly difficult question.
Tell me you haven't thought of it, Alec Marsh.
I believe it or not, I don't dream of such things, so I haven't. But come on now look. I mean, Benedict Cumberbatch is a great actor. He could be very plausible Drabble, I think. Maybe Roy Kinnear is another great actor, but Harris is quite serious, and obviously, Drabble's quite serious, and Harris is quite effervescent. So I think I would leave it to a casting director. There you are in the end. But I'd love to have the task of reviewing their decisions, I have to say.
I think are you perhaps perceiving Benedict Cumberbatch as a Basil Rathbone of our age in his role as Holmes? We shall leave it there. If there are any TV producers watching, you may want to have a look at Alec Marsh's fantastic debut novel, which is entitled Rule Britannia, which was published rather beautifully last year, and his forthcoming one, which is entitled Enemy of the Raj. Alec, it's been a huge pleasure to have you on the Lockdown LitFest. Carry on writing, keep going. It's going very well. They're beautiful books, beautifully published, and I like the way the stories are going. Thank you very much for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us as well. As ever, we are entirely doing this for your pleasure. Do feel free to email us on info@lockdownlitfest.com. Let us know who you'd like to see on this show. Let us know what you think. Send us any encouraging words you can, because it's damned hard work and we're all working extremely hard, but we're doing it in the hope that you enjoy what we're doing, that you see books, get to hear of authors that you may not have heard about, and think about reading things that you might not have considered reading. We are delighted to invite you to our Patreon page, where you can make not charitable donations, it's not a charity, but where you can make donations to keep us going, which will be at the bottom of the website down there. But in the meantime, look after yourselves, stay well, love the ones you love, and let them love you. Thanks for joining us. Cheerio.